I had a member of staff try to force himself onto another female staff member. She chose not to press charges. That didn't sit right with me. To preface, I live in a country that employs a large foreign expat workforce in pretty much every industry and in all levels. For someone to move here for work, they have to be sponsored by a company or the individual that's employing them. I own and operate a small restaurant business here and employ more than a handful of foreigners as servers, cleaners, kitchen staff, drivers, etc. So here's the story. I was lounging on my couch enjoying the last of my weekend one day when I get a call from telling me that one of our sponsored employees, a server, let's call her Janice, was picked up for indecent exposure essentially. Long story short, she was caught hooking up with a guy in a private booth at a local restaurant. Basically, the police walked in on them whilst engaged in some seriously heavy petting. They were fully clothed, but the guy she was with, or practically on top of I should say, has his junk out. Turns out he works at the restaurant 2 doors down from where she worked. After a bit of chastising and threatening to escalate the situation and have them deported to sufficiently scare their senses back into them, they let them go, but not before signing a pledge-type document promising to never repeat the offense, or else, a slap on the wrist basically, and everyone got to go home. But it doesn't end there. That night something clicked in my brain and I had the thought, how and why did the police find them in a private booth in the back of a restaurant before the restaurant's own staff did? So I called the restaurant the next day. I thought maybe they called the police on them immediately for some reason. Or maybe the couple got belligerent when staff asked him to stop. Turns out the staff didn't notice a thing. In fact, up until that day, the police have never been to that restaurant before, and when they did, they simply walked in, went straight to the back booth where the 2 were sat and busted right in. I realized this meant that someone must have seen them and called the cops on them point blank. The question was who? I decided to speak to Janice. I wanted to speak to her anyway that day, both to check in and get her version of the situation. I also gave her the employer, you did something stupid chat, and reassure her that she's keeping her job. I also wanted to ask her who she thought called her in. Without hesitation, she said it had to be Sammy, who was one of our drivers. Why do you think it was Sammy? I asked. He's the one that dropped me off at the restaurant that day. He might have seen my friend walk in right after me and called the police on us, she said. I knew the part of him dropping her off was true, that literally his job and her only free mode of transport. Well, that sounds a bit drastic. Why would he do that even if he had seen you do anything? I asked. She claimed it was because he was jealous. He was really into her apparently and kept trying to get her into bed, she said. What genuinely pissed me off was when she told me that he actually tried to force himself on her once, and she fought him off, and that he hasn't tried or even said anything since other than be very short and curt with her. My immediate response was, why on earth would you not tell me or one of your managers right away? She said she had dealt with it her way, and it stopped, plus she didn't want anybody to get fired on her account, and she didn't want any interaction with the authorities, so she decided not to make a big deal out of it in the first place. She also declined to press formal charges against him, which I advised her to do. Her declining infuriated me even more. This guy was going to get off scot-free. Now clearly I was about to fire Sammy, but in my mind that wasn't enough. For someone to attempt to rape a person basically and not get in trouble for it, not okay with me, but it seemed like it was something I had to live with. Obviously, my next conversation of the day was with Sammy. My intent was to confront him with the accusations. I called him into my office. I didn't really know where to start, so I went with, obviously you've heard about what happened to Janice this weekend. He stepped in it right away. Heard about it. Came the unexpectedly proud response from a proud of and positively beaming Sammy. I called it in. And this is where it started to get super satisfying. You see, for a couple of years since I met Sammy, every now and then he would pull out and show us all pictures of his wife, who was back home living with his mother. She was younger than him and quite beautiful, but sadly barren, which is apparently why she settled with an older fart like him. He was so proud of how pretty she was. He was also a devout religious man, or so he claimed. So I asked, and why call the police? He came back with, after I dropped her off, I waited to see who she was meeting because she's a troublemaker woman. When I saw the man walk in after her, I called police because I know him and he is married and this is against the laws of God and man. I'm smiling now. I knew I got him. Why do that instead of calling your direct manager, or even me? And before even seeing for yourself what they were doing exactly at that, why make it my problem and the company's problem what she does in her own time? Silence. Head down counting his shoes. Sammy, I know why. I know what you did. Janice just told me. I'm disgusted by you and sorry that we hired you. He had the audacity to mumble. I only tried once, sir. I almost slapped him. Anyways, I fired him. Handed him a one-way ticket home, which was in 4 hours, and told him to GTFO. This is where I get my not-so-petty revenge. I had his house phone number saved somewhere from we hired him. It was on his CV. I knew that because I called him there to interview him before we first hired him. I waited until his flight took off and dialed the number. I assumed either his mother or wife would answer the call, but I was wishing for the latter. I got my wish. Hello, Mrs. Sammy. I'm your husband's employer. Well, his former employer anyway. Just so you know, I fired him a few hours ago, and he's on a flight home as we speak. His flight number is 50. He will be arriving at blah blah blah. Just so you are aware, I was forced to fire him because he attempted to rape a fellow employee half his age. I'm sorry, I said, and promptly hung up, but not before hearing her gasping in shock.
Former manager made my life hell and I finally got her fired. I was desperate to join a new job after my husband and I were both laid off last year. When I was offered a new role, I knew it would be a step down from what I was doing, but the manager and the team seemed great, and that part has not changed. However, since my manager Gary was so busy, he basically offloaded me to another manager, Jane. I was supposed to be the connection point between my team and Jane, but it quickly became Jane micromanaging me. She would ask me to work through lunch, cancel vacation days, call at 11 p.m. on weekends, and order me around on phone calls. She also made nasty comments about my weight and said I was big for my race. The list of personal slights so long that it filled 3 pages. I would talk back to her and she did not like that, and that provoked her more. I only stayed because we needed to pay the bills. Finally, I had a mental breakdown on a Friday afternoon, after she yelled at me for something trivial about scheduling a meeting without including someone from her team who I didn't know about. I was dealing with a family tragedy and couldn't take it anymore. I told Gary about the situation with Jane and he was sympathetic and not at all surprised considering half her team quit. He immediately offered to move me to a different team under him. I was thrilled. Well, turns out going to the new team didn't help. Jane continued to order me around from afar. When I ignored her emails, she came to my desk one day and started loudly talking about how I am not qualified for this role. Gary overheard and finally told her off, but the verbal abuse did not stop. After 2 months there, I abruptly wrote my resignation letter and stapled the list of Jane's offensive comments and CC'd everyone. Gary offered a bunch of accommodations to try to keep me, but seeing how she was still provoking from afar, I said the only way for me to stay would be for her to go, and he did not have authority to let her go. Her manager was in a different country, and despite several HR complaints from at least 5 people, nothing was done. So I left, loudly and without shame, telling everyone exactly why I was leaving. Times were very bad for 3 months. There were nights we would eat slices of bread just so we could pay the mortgage and emergency expenses from a health crisis and a funeral. Even after he found a job, we were still catching up on bills and still are. I spent months applying to 5 to 10 roles per day, sometimes over 20. Last month, I saw a public memo about a big shot from a former company joining the company I just left. I used to work with this guy closely and texted him "Congrats. Let me know if you need any insights on the new place." We had a quick call where I told him some ins and outs, where I thought they could innovate. After this call, he asked me to join the team as his chief of staff. I accepted. Imagine Jane's shock when we had our one-hands call. All the VPs and above were asked to welcome the new big shot in a giant conference room. In Big Shot's speech, he breezed over that I'll be his chief of staff, along with a few key names. I now sat 2 levels above Jane, and apparently, within the 3 months I was not there, the other half of her team turned over. Every single person left. Gary was excited for me and said all nice things. However, Jane took the classless route and sent Big Shot an email about how I'm an unqualified idiot, that I used to work for her, how I tried to get her fired, and that she suspects I lied to get ahead. She didn't even try to be fake nice. Big Shot forwarded me her email and asked what this was about. I was so nervous and excited. Little did Jane know, I was a director at Big Shot's competitor company and was already a level above her, so 2 levels isn't a big leap, and I worked with him for 5 years. I had an hour call with Big Shot and told him she was bad for the company culture and was a nasty person in general, but the evidence he needed was Gary confirming that her whole team has turned over my prior resignation letter, which was still sitting on my desktop when I logged in upon return, and a few other nasty emails she sent her recent staff, which they were happy to share with us. Big Shot fired Jane on Friday. Greedy owner tries to rip off my friend, ends up paying him double. My first job out of college was for a local TV station. The owner was, and still is, the worst human being I've ever met. This guy has money, but he will cheat and lie, anything to get out of paying his bills. When I started working there, the owner had just signed a contract with Directive to become part of their broadcast package. Since they were at the time purely a local TV station, this meant that we had about 2 months to upgrade our systems so that we can start broadcasting to Directive customers in the entire Bay Area. Every day that we failed to do this past the deadline means that the owner would suffer a penalty per the contract. Not knowing about how any of this works, the owner hired a friend of mine to come in as a freelance consultant. My friend told him that for about $15,000 he can get a system that will automate the entire process, which of course this guy didn't want to pay. He tasked my friend with finding a cheaper way, around half, and to pay for all the hardware upfront and get reimbursed later. Knowing what a piece of shit this guy is, I warned my friend not to front the money because he wouldn't get paid back. The guy just smiled and said, "Watch me." So he made it work. We went live on schedule and the owner was happy. Then my friend went in and presented the guy with the bill. Immediately the usual excuses starts. "Oh, I'm a little short this month, can I pay you later, etc., etc." Then my friend pull out the trump card. Not only did my friend threaten to take all the equipments back and takes the station off the air, he reveals that in order to get the uplink working for cheap, someone had to come in every day and code the broadcast manually. It's not a terribly complicated procedure, takes less than 5 mins, but of course no one else at the station knows how to do it but him. So either the owner can pay him what he's owned plus a $2,000 consulting fee, or the station goes dark and he starts paying the penalty to Directive. The fucker paid fast. So instead of $15K, he ended up shelling out more than double that amount as my friend lapped up his $2K month fee for close to a year before he felt bad and finally teach someone there how to do it. Moral of the story: only thinking about short-term gain will always cost you more in the long run.